Welcome to our first event of the Kenyon Review Reading Series for this fall. We are very glad to have you. This is a fantastic turnout. Thank you for giving us your afternoon. We are thrilled today to have our new fellows, Keith S. Wilson and Misha Rai, here to read with us. We will have introductions by different faculty, and then at the end we will have a time for Q&A. We also have books and journals for sale in the back afterwards, yes. If you would please take a moment to make sure your cell phones are silenced. And I think this is the majority of us, but as people perhaps are trickling in, I would appreciate it if we would do like they do on the subways in New York City. If you recognize someone who seems like they might need a seat more than you, please offer it to them. All right, well, I'm Elizabeth Dark. It is very good to have you here. Thank you again for coming. I will point you toward the Kenyon Review Reading Series calendar, which is on the Kenyon Review website. We have stuff all semester. There's something next week, and then the next. We're pretty busy, and it's always going to be a good time. So thank you for being here, and I'm going to pass it on to Andy Grace.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Andy Grace. I teach in the English department, and this year I'm the acting poetry editor of the Kenyon Review. I'm going to introduce Keith Wilson. Keith comes to us from Chicago, where he was a video game designer for Resilient Games Studio, which specializes in creating games that make a positive impact on social and health-related issues. One of his projects was an augmented reality app called Earth to Mars, which he developed with a team of high school students for the Field Museum in Chicago. Visitors play as botanists in a future in which overpopulation has forced Earthlings to terraform Mars. Utilizing transmitter beacons, visitors are guided from exhibit to exhibit in order to learn which plants are most well-suited for inclusion on the soon-to-depart rocket. His first book, Field Notes on Ordinary Love, is forthcoming from Copper Canyon Press in 2019. His poems have appeared in Tri-Quarterly, The Adroit Journal, Best New Poets, Passages North, among many others. He has received fellowships and scholarships from Cave Canem, Breadloaf, the Malay Colony, and the Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop. He also has a poem in the newest issue of Poetry Magazine. It's absolutely gorgeous. The Poetry Foundation also asked Keith to come up with a playlist as a sort of soundtrack for the newest issue of Poetry, and that's available to listen to on Spotify. I encourage you to look it up. Please help me welcome Keith Wilson.
Awesome, thank you. I guess since you mentioned video games, I'm thinking about next semester in my class teaching a little bit about interactive fiction / video game writing, so that might be a thing. Keep your eyes out. Thank you, Kenyon Review, and for all the people who came who I recognized. There are people from my class, and I didn't even threaten anyone or make an assignment, so that's very, very awesome. So one thing that I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to read poems that I hardly ever read. I'm doing like what Paramore did with Misery Business, where they retired stuff. I'm going to retire most of my poems that I'm very used to reading. So many of these poems I've either never read before or I've only read a few times. So hopefully this is all new. And there's going to be a lot of love poems and a lot of references to outer space. So get ready. So this first poem is called 6:45 p.m. And the door opened in as the sapphire asserts a certainty of blue, and you through the hall like an alarm, and my body determined some parcel of space, your lips in passing, and you reclined into the silence of the bed, and must have always found yourself there while I was not thinking. How surely you dreamed. And what was in your head was a better thing than art, or rather, it was more beautiful to wonder than to know. The absent-minded stretches of you where I might, while sitting, hit a deer. What made you finally stand? It's astounding I never upset you of your mystery. Loving is a misnomer, because you are expected of your heart's opinion on a sentence that is never completed, even as you're having it. Nothing must be more free than the feeling of the right to leave. You were really something like a cutting, the way you laid yourself in water every night reading. But the days average on, and the planets circle round us like sharks. God, it's pretty, but what does any of it mean? This next poem, so there's actually like exactly 88 constellations. So when you like learn when you learn a constellation, they're like predetermined. Groups of stars that are not out of that list of 88 are called asterisms. And this poem is called Asterism. It's funny to think now of that silence with you at the desk reading and me writing on the couch separately, and the meaning of that nothing happening all around us. Were you available now to hold my hand? Or if you continued to sit sometimes still in this chair, tired of the whole world outside of us, or if I anymore wrote about possibilities other than this, or the curve of your nose, the bridge beneath my lips, that is, if the silence of the two of us was predicated by my being able now to reach you, how that quiet, that night, in this room, might seem a comfort. But instead of that, the candles between, and neither of us with anything in particular to say, the quiet trembles, because your voice isn't a feather I can hold, but a thought I draw across my throat when I close my eyes. I am trying to say that though the mass of the absence has already gone, a world revolves around it. Still, the two of us that try to speak like stars that cannot be heard because of all the things they say of space. This next poem is an ekphrastic piece, which means it's like in response to a visual work of art. It's after a painting that's by Gustave Cabat. I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. It's French. And it's a very famous painting of literally what it sounds like. There's a bunch of men without shirts on, scraping the floor of a building back before they had electric sanders. So this is called The Floor Scrapers. Whatever they say of the heart, the truth is this: we embody our hands. Every morning, I have my look at them. My hands cupping my face, a bowl of water. What will I make of these pliers, this filigree of clams? I love how the light lollops from knuckle to knuckle like a fox across a lake. What is the rest but a daydream of curves? When I am freest, when I'm at peace, it is only the light making palatable my hands, in a grasp, in a reach like this, as when a man offers his an extension and becomes before me a basilica, and I watch the gleam of the fish-throated muscles of the back, the narrow bones and knees, and I say again the knuckles, each a chamber for a whole religion performed by the hands. Hands doing, possessing, and pressing firmly to the ground to scrape. If you've ever taken the dark meat from a thigh bone by your teeth, like that. And his back is a crowbar for the actions being completed by the palms of him, his intersections, the fingers lolling over each other like men in a rocking train. And I see the light and the labor both, and the ordinary somersaults of the ribcage and viscera, they say the heart. But I see the fingers motioning like this too, in my own hand, curled like a conversation, made after light has ceased to bluster in the caverns of the eye, and sits thick and pleasant as a man having worked himself religious. Again, they say the heart. This next poem is called Scrapbook. It's a difficult poem for me to write. And recently I was asked to explain my process for writing it, and that was difficult to write. And I read it one time in public, and it was like a weird audience in general. I don't think any of them came for poetry, and they were kind of caught off guard by it. But it didn't like make me feel super great, so I just like never read it again. So this is like my second time reading it, I think. The impetus, like my inspiration for it, is sort of I was trying to sort of do a thing where it felt like scraps of a bunch of different poems, sort of the way that Sappho's poetry has come to us over history. And it's about violence and implied violence. Scrapbook. 1. Look, in the middle distance, the siren screams like a fatherless boy, unashamed. 2. Sisyphus hikes up her dress. She labors pushing, always a man. And if she shrugs, he rolls atop her or the town at the foot of the hill. Or a man calling himself Sisyphus knocks and says push is a man's verb, but she can help. Or else he says quiet. 3. It's said we are afraid of what we don't understand. Who among us is shaken by Latin? We are terrified of what might overtake us. Sadness, marriage, Spanish, rain. 4. Like a sextant, he angled himself as if to kiss, his hands in the ocean of her eyes and his knee pressed against the air like a rudder. 5. How can I make you understand? As a boy, I held a bell in my hand, and I grew to be a man who looks back on that bell. 6. What is there to say? That was yesterday. 7. The first thing Odysseus decides when he returns is to cock his bow, fire in the crowd. Over and over, bullets move at flirtatious angles. 8. In the city, the first November rain laps at a set of heels. 9. A family of plantains. No one speaks their name. Actually, a silence, even when they are perfect and brown. Every domestic, familiar, unpretty thing. 10. I'll say it again. If a hand is big enough, it doesn't matter what you call it. 11. The story of Orpheus and the bear is this. Orpheus, of course, sings. His wife is distinguished by her marriedness to Orpheus. Jumping ahead, he left behind his clothing, his furniture, and everything. 12. There is an old story of a man. That is the story. There is an old story of a woman that the old story of the man spoke over. I am his son. 13. Imagine here the voice of a woman. 14. A list of all that is fixed, only the ground. This next poem is, so there's like a section of this poem that's like about birds, because it's a poem. And it's that whole part is like in parentheses. I don't know that it sounds like it's in parentheses, but I promise you it's on the page. So this is called a short list of grievances. First, you are invisible, which is another word for Jesus, she's gone. Second, the medulla oblongata makes you automatic. So even when I am not thinking of your hips, I am thinking of your hips. The dreams I have dreamed of being loosed like a sparrow would pronounce themselves into wilder dreams if I were a bird already. I would have to eat nothing until I was thin as the air and I'd baffle the moon. My simple machines turning the sky like a mobile. I could be ready, heave and release, only the nothing of a bird. Third, you are right. I am cabinetry. I'm a man that needs to know conclusively that he's empty. Your name, you know, is a midnight call. I am talking too much about air and hardly about breath. Who do you think really makes me lift my chest? This should be simple, but never is. Consider the wing to whom the burden of air becomes the burden of flight. The last poem that I'm going to read is a poem that just came out in poetry, and I usually don't read it for two reasons. One is it's like very long, so get ready for that too. And the second reason is that, so I sent this poem out to like 25 different places and they all rejected it with like no like kind words or whatever. And I'm a poet and I'm stubborn, and so I kept sending it out anyway, but it still kind of weighs on you sometimes. You're like, maybe this is not great, but I'm gonna keep giving it a shot. So I haven't really read this very many times in public. It's called Heliocentric. And it has an epigraph which is, "If I beg and pray you to set me free, then bind me more tightly still." Homer. I'm striving to be a better astronaut, but consider where I'm coming from, the exosphere, a desk where the bluest air thins to a lip. Impossible to know the difference from where I sit and space. I promise I still dream of coming back to you, settling on your yellow for the kitchen. We won't fight. Let it not manifest. Not over the crumpled bodies of laundry. Let us not row over the nail polish, its color, the spilled sun. Inspiration is the deadliest radiation. It never completely leaves your bones. You know. From here, there are no obstructions but the radiant nothingness. An aurora borealis opens like a fish. This, to the pyramids, yes, to a great wall. And there you are, moving from curtain to curtain. Oh, to fantasize of having chosen some design with you. But the moon's over Jupiter. But asteroids like gods deadened by the weight of waiting. I remember you said pastel for the cabinet where the spice rack lives. That I ought to have picked you up flowers when I had a chance. Daisy, iris, sun, red roses, ultraviolet, the color of love. What else but this startles the air open like an egg? I'm really trying to be better, to commit to memory the old songs about the ground, to better sense your latitudes, see the corona of your face, take your light as it arrives. Earth is heavenly too, but know that time is precious here, how wine waits years and years to peak. What is there to do? I've made love to satellites in your name. I'm saying I can't say when I'll return. Remember me, for here are dragons and the noble songs of sirens, stars that sway Elysian, ships that will not moor, lovers who are filled with blood and nothing more. Who could love you like this? Who else will sow you in the stars? Who better knows your gravity and goes otherwise to catastrophe? I've schemed and promised to bring you back a ring from Saturn, but a week passes, or doesn't manage. Everything steers impossible against the boundless curb of light. Believe I tried for you, against space. Time takes almost everything away. To you, for you, a toast to the incredible. I almost wish I'd never seen the sky when always there was you. Sincerely. Thank you.
Keith, thank you so much. I'm Kirsten Reach, fiction editor of the Kenyon Review, and I just want to say Misha and Keith have honored us tonight with their reading, but also by dropping their lives to come join us in Gambier. So I hope you get to meet them, I hope you get to study with them, I hope you get to talk with them after this, and I hope you get to hear them read again. Misha Rai's writing strikes close to the bone. I was on the porch in the sun the first time I read a piece of her novel in progress, which is titled Blood We Did Not Spill, about the first woman in the Indian police force to command a prison. I want you to think police lights, a full moon, flower smells in the night, beautiful fabric, and a sense of danger. You're able to sense that there's a murder before she tells you that it's happened. You're gonna get chills. I don't care if you're out on the porch or inside. I don't care where you're reading. Her work hits you immediately and it goes deep. But the officer at the center of her story goes on to dig into the history of the prison, decisions made by the first female prime minister of India during the undemocratic period of the emergency of the 1970s. This is an author who isn't afraid to take on the big stuff, and all the while she writes deftly about family, loyalty, justice, and really badass women. Misha's essay To Learn About Smoke Must First Light a Fire won this year's Dogwood Literary Nonfiction Prize. Congratulations. And Judge Patrick Phillips says it is a complex, evocative, and often funny personal essay that summons up the past in vivid detail and interrogates the family myths that can come to rule our lives. I love how deftly this piece moves between family drama and the larger political forces of Indian independence, colonialism, and feminism, and chronicles one woman's struggle to honor both her family's past and somehow break from it. Her prose has received many awards, including a McDowell Colony Fellowship in 2018, the Dana Award in the novel category in 2017 for her novel in progress, and the Woodrow Wilson Dissertation Fellowship for Women's Studies in 2016. Please join me in welcoming Misha Rai.
That was such a nice introduction. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Elizabeth, for putting this together. Where are you? So I'm a little terrified because my father's in the audience. And this is the first time I'm reading with a family member in the audience. So if in a Q&A he raises his hand and I ignore him, there's a reason for that. He's wonderfully supportive and critical at the same time. Also, I'm standing here and I realized that the last time I was here, I gave a reading and I taught. And I was desperately hoping to be a Kenyon Review Fellow at the time. And I'm hoping I'm exaggerating this, but I feel like I reached out my claw-like hand and grabbed hold of David Lynn and said, please, please, please let me come. So I think I did something of that sort, but anyways, I'm going to read nonfiction today as opposed to fiction because my novel isn't finished and I am sort of terrified of reading aloud from it. But I am reading the essay that Kirsten was kind enough to talk about. But I'm reading only the first half because the second half is more personal and my dad's in that part, so I left it out. I will instead read the first part of the essay, and it's more of a personal essay, so it looks at the world outside and sort of looks at my family. So to learn about smoke, one must first light a fire. In 1968, my uncle, 6 years old at the time, with what he believed to be his unique concoction of water and petrol, unevenly doused the sofa in the drawing room, wriggled under it, and when he had positioned himself exactly in the middle of the four-seater, struck a match. The odor of his mischief reached Dai, the woman who raised him and my mother and my aunt, a moment before it reached my grandmother. Dai had just finished putting away the bucket of water and wet mop she used to clean the floors, and was unhitching her sari so that her legs, exposed an inch above her knees all the way to her ankles, would again be appropriately covered. My grandmother was one lick away from closing the flap of an envelope, the last of 2 sets of lavender envelopes that contained weekly letters to her many siblings and cousins. The unlicked, thus also unglued corner of the envelope would later haunt my grandmother, who was convinced that all postmen steamed open the post given any kind of provocation. "This is India," she would say, a phrase she repeats even now, as explanation whenever challenged about her absolute belief in the miscreancy of the Indian government and its representatives. Like many children of the 1940s, born into the upper class and caste, my grandmother, proud to be part of independent India, nevertheless missed the imagined efficiency of the colonizer. It was true that the British had industrialized India, but it was also true that no matter how hard they tried, they could never get the trains to arrive at their assigned stations on time or begin a meeting at an appointed hour, because Indians submitted their own notion of time, Indian standard, where a couple of minutes never means 2, but in actuality stretches to 15 or 20. And like those of her generation and others, and some others that came after, roiling deep within my grandmother's consciousness was the belief that the British as a species were somehow better, that they had raised the Indian character by their superior presence. And so absolute was this belief that my grandmother, like many others, often forgot what India and Indians were truly like. Reams of records and personal accounts in the British Library detail the frustration with which the British had tried to transform the country. Unlike other rulers before them who had understood that the only way to govern such a land and its people was to become a part of it, the English fueled the fires that ripped the country into 2. When they were finally kicked out, because they were kicked out, they left it in chaos, close to the way they believed they had found it. India is the fierce kink in the forelock of my grandmother's hair, repeatedly oiled, bobby-pinned, pinioned into an unlikely plait, even shorn close to her head, always unwilling to stay under the sari pallu that covered her hair, the place custom dictated for it to remain, a real hairdressing headache, yet also a physical characteristic that added to my grandmother's beauty and grace, whether she accepted it or not. Hurrying to find the cause of the smell she couldn't properly identify, smoke so out of place in her home, my grandmother had pressed the base of her fingers on the flap, sealed that last letter, and tossed it on a pile of similar envelopes. Because my uncle could not reach high enough to lock the doors of the drawing room, 2 in total, both the women felt they had fallen sideways into assailing smoke the moment they pushed the doors open. Dai began hitting one part of the sofa with towels she had wet under the kitchen sink. She, acquainted lifelong with smoke that arose from burning wood and combustible cloth, necessary fuel that helped cook her meals on the dung-cleansed clay stove in her mud hut, knew exactly what to do. She opened the windows as well. My grandmother and Dai were halfway through putting out the fire when they heard the click-click from under the sofa. My uncle Dai dragged out ankles first. He had been clinking shoe buckle against shoe buckle, a sound he manufactured when he was excited. His nose and mouth were wrapped in his older sister's red woolen muffler. My grandmother, when she could look at her son clearly, slapped him. Family lore has it that having realized as a young mother that her cream-colored hands were too soft, not exactly weak, but just not built for the kind of disciplining her 3 children sometimes needed, my grandmother came up with other ways to punish her children when they misbehaved. On one occasion, she took a bowl of cornflakes and milk and poured it over an offending head. Us children believed that she used to sit at her desk in the afternoons thinking of new ways to torture us while Lata Mangeshkar sang songs of love in the background, my uncle likes to say. Usually a wriggling of eyebrows follows that remark. Radio and torture went hand in hand, no? Isn't that true, Moti Mummy? He will pinch his mother's waist, holding the roll of fat in his hand before she swats him away. It took Dai and me all morning to get the cornflakes out of his hair, and he still reeked of milk for days. My grandmother always says quickly in response, tapping her nostrils lightly for emphasis. The story goes that my grandmother, after she peeled my uncle off of Dai's one exposed leg, knee, calf, ankle, made him sit on the half-burnt sofa to await the judgment of his father without so much as wiping the soot off his face or letting Dai change his clothes. No food was to pass his lips until he learned his lesson. Dai, who had been ordered to go home, refused without saying the words no. She packed her things up and sat down to wait on the steps outside the back door. She sat guard for as long as it took for my uncle to be sent off to bed that night, barging in to take charge of him without a word to my grandparents. He was the child she loved first when she came to work for my grandparents as a young woman, long before her own children were born. She fed him boiled eggs, his favorite comfort food, after she bathed him gently, all the while grumbling at him for almost having died. My grandfather was downstairs in the surgery operating on a woman with cataract. Around the time my uncle lit his match, his father administered a slap across this patient's face. Earlier that day, as the only doctor and surgeon in the coal mining area of Dhanbad, my grandfather had been called out to the village of Wasepur. In 2012, the bloody history of Wasepur, beginning in the 1940s with when the British Raj seized farmlands in Dhanbad for their coal, to the 1990s when 2 rival mafia families fought almost to extinction, would be immortalized into a 4-hour movie, long by even Bollywood standards. But on the day my grandfather drove over, following closely behind his police escort, wounds needed patching up. Some of the teenage boys my grandfather worked on, setting their bones, suturing knife wounds, digging out bullets, went on to join the local mafia and were dead within 10 years, by the time my uncle was 16. My grandfather came back with his right shirt sleeve ringed in inches of blood. Since he had missed the consultation time reserved in the mornings with his patients, he went straight into surgery. Every afternoon, he devoted a portion of his time to operate on coal miners with various eyes, nose, throat issues. But before them came the patients who paid not only for their own surgeries, but the surgeries he performed after, for free. And among these paying patients was the woman he slapped. She had insisted that her husband be allowed to stay with her in the operating room. Her request was refused. After much persuasion from the head nurse, she agreed to go ahead with the operation. A local anesthetic was applied, so while her face grew numbed, she would not stop fidgeting or crying, and my grandfather's hand shook each time he tried to cut into her eye. Afterwards, my grandfather would tell the patient's shocked husband, "This is India." The operation was a success. He used the same words to describe the altercation that happened in the surgery to his wife, and she needed no other explanation. He was aware that spouses and parents were now being allowed into some operating theatres in other parts of the world, even in the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Sunderland in Britain, where he had worked before returning to India. But he did not believe the mores of his operating theatre could adapt to such modern delicacies. For decades, he had worked with coal miners, men who helped fuel the nation, who needed him the most, who asked little of him and did what he requested. He was tired of Indians who came back to the country for medical procedures that cost them less in India, yet wanted the hospital culture to emulate those of the Western countries they lived in. Years later, when my aunt made an offhand remark about how all the patients who received such treatment, because there were others her father slapped, were always somehow women, my mother would quietly say, "Don't you know these are Indian women and this is India?" Only to have her ear chewed out by my grandmother, who was just as cross at what was being implied as she was at my mother's discomforting appropriation of the phrase. "Yes, this is India," she snapped at her daughters. My uncle, who had costumed himself up in the outfit, dress shorts and shirt, he had worn a few weeks ago to sit for a portrait his parents had commissioned of him, was trying hard not to swing his legs against the damaged sofa, as he thought of ways to make his explanation, his story of why he conducted the experiment or burned the sofa, more elaborate. He had failed to impress his mother with his original excuse. What gibberish had been her response? He had got it into his little 6-year-old head that a grand beginning of his tale would do the trick. He was convinced his father would appreciate that he had worn his best clothes to carry out this important experiment. Nothing he said that day would have helped him, but if he had stuck to the truth, that he wanted to see how smoke was made, perhaps it could have helped diminish the manner in which his punishment was administered. Dai got rid of my uncle's clothes after my grandmother decided they were not fit to be worn, but for decades they could be seen in the portrait that hung in our ancestral home in Dhanbad. My uncle is painted on canvas as a serious little boy, standing next to a large chair, dressed in a starched white shirt, blue shorts, and a red tie to complete his outfit. In his hand is a pistol. His finger is not quite on the trigger, and he holds it lopsided, but his chest is puffed out with pride. These last two details, his inability to quite grasp a weapon which, if loaded and discharged, might mean the difference between life or death, and his misplaced pride in what he is failing to accomplish, characterized my uncle for the rest of his life. My uncle would qualify to enter the army as an officer at 18, but his parents would not permit him to join. India had already gone to war 3 times since he was born. He would then gain admission to study at the London School of Economics, but would not be allowed to take up his place. His mother would tell her friends that it was enough that he had gotten in. He did not have to go so far away to prove his merit. Besides, there were plenty of good universities in India. What remained unspoken was that my uncle, as their only son, would inherit everything, so would want for nothing. He would fall in love with a Norwegian journalist, but give her up when he kept putting off introducing her to his parents, and eventually his courage failed him. He would go to film school, but never risk making any movies. He would qualify to work for the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, but quit just as he reached a position that empowered him to make important broadcasting decisions. He would invest in a restaurant that would fail. He would never again hold a job for more than a few months. And all the while, he would talk and talk and talk about the things he could have, would have, should have done, and some things he had done. But everything was exaggerated and muddled in his telling until people stopped believing him. As that realization sunk in, he seemed compelled to continue talking. But his stories changed, becoming more outrageous until only half-truths and lies remained. My uncle was the person children of my generation were warned against becoming. My baby brother and our youngest cousin, quiet as they are given to telling savory, unsavory stories in oddly loud voices when they get started. My aunt's cousin and I, the 2 talkers, don't know when to shut up and what not to say. All 4 of us are, and still were and still can be, champion boasters. Often in the privacy of our homes and always at family gatherings, just as soon as my uncle is out of earshot, one of us is told off for acting like him. Often the person doing the telling off is one of our fathers, men who are only related to my uncle by marriage. Still growing up, all of us loved him, begged him to tell us this story or that one, and only when we saw more of ourselves in him than we wanted to, did I begin to feel a deep shame in who he was. But on that day, he was still a little boy. his mind racing to come up with an impressive excuse that could save him. My grandmother sat across from him, pasting stamps onto envelopes, barely paying attention to what she was doing. Fear at almost losing her only son, the boy child she had prayed for desperately, as Indian women are conditioned to, finally stilled her. To my grandfather, my uncle would loudly say, I wanted to see how fire was made. He was thrashed, a word and deed the English nuns gave as a gift to my grandmother, who had studied at a convent school, and she passed it along as appropriate punishment to be meted out thoroughly by my grandfather. Apart from the human bodies my grandfather patched up in Vasepur that morning, he had also written a death certificate for the charred corpses of a family that had been caught in the crossfire. Their house was next door to a rival gang members. The dead children, 4 of them, born in quick succession, were not much older than my uncle. Usually, before my uncle was disciplined, he was allowed time to prepare himself for the beating, and his father spoke to him between each lash. Not words of comfort exactly, but he felt comforted nonetheless. This time, my uncle was hauled up and upended on the coffee table. My grandmother, unable to move, watched the first lash fall, and apart from the sound itself, there was silence. Each time my grandfather's hand fell to his side, my uncle saw the belt and the ring of blood on his father's shirt sleeve. I imagined that it was this image, the first defining memory for my uncle, and the subsequent disapproving silences that followed a firm no, every time he decided to take any action as an adult that made him into who he is. A man who never learned how to turn potential into accomplishment, a quality real life demanded of him. Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, so Keith, for like the scrapbook poem, are you imagining each of those scraps is coming from like a distinctive like setting, a distinctive genre, those kinds of things, or how did all the pieces come together for that?
So, part of it, I wrote just like a lot of associative leaps, sort of. So, I would write part of it and then come up with like a different topic and write about that. But I actually also inserted excerpts or entire poems of 6 other poems, like very short poems. So in some ways it like actually is like a fragmented series of things that I've written. The things that I inserted from other poems, the topics of those poems were sometimes like not at all related to the subject, and they became related when they were inserted in the poem. So yeah, I don't normally necessarily write like that, but it ended up coming out that way for that particular poem.
I have a question for Misha. So when you write about, I guess, childhood or experiences from far in your past, how do you like maintain a sense of authenticity as you write, or like feel true to that experience while also having to make certain leaps, I would assume?
And that's a really good question. And actually, I was so nervous that I forgot to say this right before I was reading this, that and I forget the writer's name, again, nervousness, but somebody really smart said this, that like any kind of writing is you're taking a view of the world. And it's the same thing when you write about your family, it's just your perspective. I'm pretty sure if my brother was in the room, or like, I'm trying to ignore my dad, but like any other member of my family was in the room, like they would be like, okay, the same set of events, but how they perceive it would be different. This essay was also like the first time I wrote something really long. It is much longer. There's like almost 10 more pages that I haven't read. And it was, the way it worked was I knew that certain things had happened in my uncle's life, and I knew I wanted to write about British colonialism and how it still exists in India. And we don't even realize it. We've internalized that. And like various things I wanted to talk about, or the idea that that my grandfather was a really nice man, but also he did like he was also very sexist, obviously. And the way patriarchy works and things like that. And so I worked off of what I knew, and then it's about language. And then it's about the kind of truth that you're trying to get at, and like trying to understand my uncle, who I loved a great deal, and I love a great deal. But also, I'm, in a way, like when we write about family, we're writing about ourselves, so I'm terrified that I would become him. So it's like dealing with that terror, like could I be him? Like could I, because I don't know how it works for poets, or for other writers, but I have lots of fallow time. Like I have concentrated writing, and then there are days where I just binge watch TV. I just sit there and I'm like zombie. My husband could try to talk to me and there'd be nothing from me. He has to stand in front of the TV to get my attention. So it's like, why was I saying this? Sorry. Just having a moment.
Writing process.
Sorry, process, yes, process. Oh, this is not embarrassing at all. I hope I've sort of answered you.
Yeah, you have. Maybe that's a good process.
Yeah, lots of binge watching and writing, lots of reading, lots and lots of reading. That's the other procrastination. I realized the more nonfiction I read, the more I realized that that so much of nonfiction is trying to get to a truth, whether it's about your family or like about the truth of life. And so if I stick to that, if I'm trying to like investigate something, and I write circuitously, so that helps too. Like I cannot look at something straight in the eye. So with nonfiction. Oh God, yes.
I'm Misha's student. So I have a question for you, Misha. If you were to write this essay again, given the recent events in India's legal system, would you write it differently?
I mean, I've written an essay that sort of deals with my brother, and that would be related to, like right now India decriminalized homosexuality, so I would definitely look at it differently from that perspective. But this essay, is not really affected by that. Or I could write about how when the British left, they left us with a lot of their terrible, horrible laws, and then they went off and like fixed their laws. That's the gift the British gave the world. So, sorry.
So it seems like several of your pieces utilize lists as well as narratives, and I wonder how you felt those interacted or worked together to like enhance or play off one another.
That's a really good question. So as I've continued to write, my poetry has tended to become more and more associative or lyrical, so it tends not to be as narrative driven, but there's like a part of me, when I was like in middle school and even elementary school, I thought I would be a novelist. Like I thought I was gonna write novels, partially just because that's the only thing I knew that people wrote. Like I didn't super know anything about poetry or other kinds of writing. But I'm still sort of tied to that, to structure of some kind. And I think that's part of why I tend to list things, is a part of me really wants to go wild and just do really associative things that will kind of leave the reader or listener feeling something, but like the problem, if there is a problem with that, is that you often don't know what's happening. You might have to spend time to figure that out. And that's fine, but I also kind of want to give them the reader something to be anchored by too. And I think lists can sort of do that. They sort of contextualize what I'm talking about. You can kind of figure out like what this list is about. All these things have something in common. So I think that's part of the reason I do that, and the reason that I leave from it is I'm not like 100% comfortable even with that, with like very guided writing. So I'm starting to write more lyric essays, and those tend to be much more structured. It's much easier to tell why I'm talking about each thing, even if I make huge leaps. So I go back and forth basically. Does that answer your question?
So you already answered this kind of deep. So for Misha, how have you like sort of settled into a style or several like combinations of styles as you've like written over time, and how has that like formed like how you
With nonfiction, to be honest, I don't have a style. Like every essay I've written has been different. You can tell it's me because I'm a maximalist writer, so the sentences are long, and then I have to go back, and the thing that I do is like I have to go back and break them, because sometimes they're so long that even I don't understand them. I get to the end of it, and I'm like, I have no idea what I wrote. So gotta go back and do that. But with fiction, it's been, I used to write really fast and really shitty. So, and now I write really slowly. So that means I don't have to change the words. And I think it's also with novels, at least, my work is voice driven. If I know the voice of my characters, I'm able to I can embody that. And I read a lot of Dickens. I go back to Dickens again and again and again, and I'll read a lot of Dickens, and the way all his minor characters are also full bodied, and they're just, there's Madame Defarge from The Tale of Two Cities. Yes, in which she's she's, the thing that she does is she stands behind this counter and she knits, but what she's knitting is a code in her knitting. There's this whole, and so it's just interesting how he creates these characters. And I think for me, once I find the voice, I can do that. And I always think about what is that one thing that drives them, kind of. And so that's the difference between before it was ooh, I want to tell a story where a crash happens, or just making things happen is important, but also just knowing the characters is important. And making things happen is very important because that's when you get paid.
Oh, fiction writing.
Okay, it's all about the money.
This is just a question for Keith. Interactive writing and video games have a lot of differences with writing poetry, especially when it comes to the audience. So I was wondering if you could speak to how your relationship with your audience has changed in video game writing now.
Oh, whoa. I'm not used to getting video game questions. It's awesome. So one thing, as a poet, I'm profoundly disappointed at how poetry is not a popular art form at all. It has a very narrow audience that are often other poets, which is cool. But I think there's a lot of poetry out there that could reach the same people who play video games. And I love that video games is a popular art form. It's a thing that not everyone plays, but a lot more people feel comfortable playing something, whether it's a game on your cell phone or a game on a computer or a game on Xbox or whatever. So I think part of it has to do with, part of the way that it's sort of changed the way I look at things is it makes me I think it makes me more concerned with my audience than I used to be. When I was a younger poet who started to leave narrative, I did not care if people didn't get my poems. Which I feel was a mistake. Why am I writing? Hopefully someone is reading this and getting something out of it. The other thing that I just find very interesting, because I get to write in both, is that poetry is almost entirely about intentionality. So in a lot of ways, you are writing something intending on a person feeling something or getting some sort of message. There's some room there for people to have their own reads. But most of the time, a poet sort of wants something to come across. And it's not as if that's not a thing in video games, but video games are often about branching narratives, and it's way harder to control what's happening there. So you can't make a person experience a thing without taking their choice away, which is the whole point of video games. And so writing them ends up being radically different in a lot of ways, and I think it helps me go from one to the other. Because I'm able to explore these radically different sort of notions of what art is. Yeah.